Next, we are going to have speaking Professor Jose Alaniz. I hope I pronounced that correctly? Who is Associate Professor in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literature and the Department of Comparative Literature at the University of Washington, Seattle. And Professor Alaniz published his first book, Comic Art in Russia, in 2010. He has also published articles in a number of journals, as well as in anthologies, and his research interests include death and dying, disability studies, film studies, eco-criticism, which was a new one for me, and comic studies. And his current projects include a study of disability in Russian cinema. He's going to speak to us now on disability in Russian visual art. Professor Alaniz.
Thank you. And everybody hear me? So thank you very much for having me here. It's great to be back in London after about 6 years, I think. So what I'm going to do is give a very schematic, and I apologize for that, very schematic kind of historical survey kind of presentation on disability in Russian visual culture, and it's going to kind of speak sort of a highlights reel, really is what I'm presenting here, but I'm happy to get into any of these topics in more detail in Q&A. And I realize I only have about 15 minutes, so I guess Rachel will just follow my commands. So when we talk about disability in Russian culture in general, the holy fool, right, the cultural institution and role of the holy fool kind of comes up very often in Russian, certainly since the Middle Ages, in Russian culture since the Middle Ages. What do we mean by the holy fool? Obviously, this is a very religious and specifically Christian understanding of disability in the sense of a kind of divine intervention in ordinary life, a person that has been touched by God, a person who lives as a fool, right? And the term is Russian, and there's a number of different terms. The most common are blazhenny or yurodivy, is the figure that often appears in the chronicles, that appears in some of the religious writings, and in some of the icons even. And of course, the most famous of these holy fools would be Saint Basil. Next slide, please. Who of course is the figure for whom the famous onion domed church on Red Square is named after, right? And so he was obviously a figure associated with Ivan the Terrible. Next, please. But if we look at the holy fool in painting, and certainly as a kind of representative figure, not only for Russian Christianity, but also for Russian kind of national identity, we see him, it's usually a man. There were other, of course, there were also female holy fools, but primarily we see men represented, and we see them, thank you very much, that helps. Is that better? Yes, much better, I'm sure. Actually, let me kind of stand this way. We see the holy fool kind of appearing in paintings. This is a pretty good example by Nesterov from the 19th century, where you see basically, obviously, the image is in the great Russian landscape out in the heartland. We see various figures representing Russian culture, including Dostoevsky, Solovyov, Tolstoy, and other people there. But you'll notice that also among them there is that figure here, the holy fool, who, as you can tell, is usually half naked. He is often wearing chains. That's a kind of pagan element, and the iron to ward off evil spirits. And he usually is someone who is behaving in unconventional ways, someone who does not conform to conventional rational thought, and who is obviously, again, but seen very much at the center on some level of a particular kind of approach to God, really. Next slide, please. And so you have, even today, right, modern icons that deal with the holy fool. Again, looking at mental difference, right, in a very particularly kind of religious sensibility. Next, please. And we see here, as we get more into the modern era, right, into later in the 19th century and on into the 20th, we see kind of Russian artists looking at the holy fool, obviously in very different ways, in light of modern theories of psychiatry and psychology. And so here, not yet, please. And here, for example, we can have the Blessed One by Prof looking, at a holy fool. Obviously, you can tell not only by his dress and the iron, but also by the fact that he is standing barefoot in winter, right? Again, not conforming to the usual kind of conventions of behavior. But also, what's also, I think, very different and more modern about this representation is the expression on his face, right? The way in which he looks, not only perhaps like he's staring off into the heavens or into some other world, but also how we might start thinking about madness and about psychiatric difference here is I think, makes it a very different representation. Next, please. Now, again, the other kind of way in which the disabled often appear in Russian visual culture before the 20th century and even onwards is, of course, as people who are subject to pity, people who are usually begging on the streets or who have very visual deformities, people like this. And of course, this is a very famous painting by Ilya Repin that's representing a religious procession, but you see there on the side we have some of the homeless people and others begging for alms, and one of whom is, of course, that boy who is, again, they're being whipped by someone and kept apart. So there is this sense, isn't there, in the representation of the disabled that they are subjects of pity, they are perhaps, in some respects, kind of Christ-like in their suffering on earth and in their relationship with God, but they're also kept apart in a very real way from the mainstream, literally in this painting, of Russian life. Next, please. So I'm sorry I'm going very quickly through some of this, but again, we can pick up on some of these questions in Q&A. So there is this, then, in pre-revolutionary Russian culture, what I call a love-pity model, or Любовь-жалость model towards the disabled. On the one hand, they are closer to God, they are their very suffering and their very physical differences and cognitive differences are a sign that they are a kind of a different population, closer to the divine. And so they deserve pity, they deserve alms, but they're also seen as almost a kind of sacrificial figure. They are carrying the burdens for our sins, and in that respect, that seems to be part of the fulfillment of their function. There is, of course, not much discussion about integrating them into ordinary kind of human society, because their role is precisely to be outside of ordinary human society. In a very real way, they're not human beings in the same way that you and that so-called able-bodied people might be. In any case, their great reward, right, will be in heaven. So there is this kind of static model, isn't there, about the disabled? Their function is to basically be what they are, and there's certainly no impetus to get to change, to accommodate them in some other way. And so that's what's by and large what you see as the pre-revolutionary kind of model for the visual representation of the disabled. Next, please. Now, as we get into the 20th century and obviously into the Soviet period, and again, there's a lot that one could say about the way that the Soviets did and didn't try to integrate the disabled in terms of the labor force. But in looking at things like this poster, for example, what strikes me is obviously it is a propaganda poster. It's trying to get a particular message across, first and foremost about traffic safety, right? So the message is, I did not follow the traffic rules, and so therefore I lost my leg. And for those who read Russian, you'll recognize that the body of this man is formed by the letter Ya, which means I, but it's, of course, it's the letter Ya that's kind of truncated with one of its legs, so it's a quite striking visual image. But notice again here that in this representation, and in some others that I could show you, the burden, right, is being placed on the individual. The individual did not follow kind of collective rules, did not follow the proper behavior, and therefore there has been punishment, right? There's been, again, this sense in which the disabled person on some level is deserving of this kind of fate, right? And so it is, again, on some level, a kind of static presentation for a very, very different secular reason now. Next, please. I did have a clip that I was going to show you from a film, but the tech isn't working. It really doesn't matter because I don't have that much time anyway. But the other great model, certainly after World War II, for depicting the representation in Russian visual culture is, of course, veterans and injured people who were coming out of the war. And that is one way in which one could say that there is a positive depiction, unequivocally positive depiction of the disabled. In the case of one of the most famous of these people, Alexei Marieshev, who was a World War II ace who was shot down by the Germans, goes through rehabilitation and really at his own insistence and through his own kind of striving, returns to the air and to fight more Germans with his prosthetic legs after he loses his legs. There's a very famous book that by Boris Polivoy that comes out based on his life, and then an even more famous film from 1948. That's a classic of socialist realist kind of approaches to this, and so it's a wonderfully kind of life-affirming, a positive image. At the same time, of course, one could argue that it's a particularly Stalinist image in that the figure of Mariesa really basically gives up everything for the greater glory not only of Russia but of Stalin, one can say. And so there's a lot of baggage there, one might say. Next slide, please. Getting on into the 60s and on into the closer to the present day, we can see by and large, while there might be some depictions of the disabled, like Mariesa and other kind of more positive ones, something like what Vadim Sidor is doing in the 60s is actually kind of rare and rather really striking and disconcerting, of course, in trying to represent war in this way, and it's in a much more darker kind of tone. On the one hand, right, we can talk about this as a metaphorical use of disability, the way that it shatters lives and shatters limbs and destroys bodies and also destroys, obviously, kind of people's souls, right? But first and foremost, right, we're seeing here a rather figurative and literalist representation of a very damaged body deserving of pity as well. So it is, on the one hand, he's talking about war in a more kind of universal way. One can also relate it perhaps to the treatment of veterans and to within a Russian context. Next, please. Now, getting into the post-Soviet area, and I realize I'm covering a lot of ground very quickly here. I apologize for that. We can see, certainly with perestroika and glasnost and on into the post-Soviet period, really an explosion of representations of the disabled in the visual media, in the newspapers and the press coverage, and in the on television. They just kind of become much more evident, certainly. And if you spent time in Russia in the 90s, as I did, living there, you would certainly see a lot more of these people out on the streets. Now I realize that as Irina was saying, things have kind of changed and you don't necessarily often see them there, but you would see images like this during the 90s, the collapse of the social safety net and all these other things we needed to do. A lot of people simply resorted to begging, and this was in Moscow. Next, please. As well as things that become kind of more obvious, like races and other kind of organized events and athletic events. Things like the Perspectiva Festival, the Cinema Without Barriers Festival, again, is another one that comes on in the 2000s. So there is a little bit more of this sort of thing that you see, but obviously still not enough. Next, please. Now, okay, well, I was going to talk about other kinds of activism, but I'm running out of time, so let me go on past this. In the West, certainly, we talk about the so-called kind of normalization or the normal model of disability, as opposed to other models that tend to incorporate ideas of sensationalism or things like the freak show, right, in American culture. An image like this, which is the cover to a textbook, Higher Education for People with Disabilities, Problems and Perspectives, is really kind of the impetus or the goal, I should say, for representing the disabled as simply ordinary citizens who happen to have a physical difference, right, and kind of not loading it with any kind of other content, ideological or aesthetic of any other kind. And that seems to be the kind of ways in which I think we're starting to go in some of this imagery. Next, please. On the other hand, we have still a lot of the sensationalism. Thank you. A lot of the exoticization of the disabled, a lot of the grotesque kind of depiction that you see in the 1990s, as in, for example, this film by Alexei Balabanov, a very famous director of the 1990s, and even today, he was responsible for the Brother films, for example, which were tremendous hits. But he has this other film from 1998 of Freaks and People, which really very much traffics in this representation of in this case, a pair of Siamese twins who are basically kind of presented not only as physical others, but even ethnic others. And there's much being made there about the kind of exploitational side of this kind of thing. Next, please. Two other things that I don't know if there's going to be another presentation later on today on disability, on deafness in Russian cinema, but we could say that there are perhaps maybe more positive representations that we see in the 90s and in the early aughts, like this film, A Land of the Deaf. Although even this film is rather problematic because the main character, or the character that's deaf, Yaya, is a holy fool kind of way. And again, I'd have to show you the clip to kind of get at this, but maybe we can discuss the film later on. I assume the person we'll be talking about it later. Yes, next please. To other films like this, getting closer to the present day, like A Driver for Viera, which was actually a fascinating film dealing with a kind of something that's very potent these days in Russian culture and visual culture, a nostalgia for the Soviet past. Not a pure nostalgia, I would say, because it's definitely looking at problematic aspects. But in this film in particular, what we have is a woman with, I believe it's spina bifida. She walks with a kind of a difficult gait. But it becomes a kind of love triangle between her, she's the darker-haired woman, and the blonde-haired woman who is able-bodied. It's a love triangle between those two and her driver. And so it's a fascinating film because it starts off with a kind of a pitying kind of impulse for this woman, but by the end of it, she's basically kind of competing with which I would argue is a kind of physical ideal of Russian femininity, which is this blonde-haired, statuesque, blue-eyed woman, and it becomes they're kind of equals in their contest for the love of this man. So I thought that was actually kind of very interesting. Next, please. I already talked about the Cinema Without Barriers Film Festival, but it's, again, an important, I think, development. Next, please. And let me finish up, since there was a mention that I do work on comics. And so there is also in comics, which are a very peripheral and very small kind of part of the cultural scene in Russia, their own, I think, obviously representations of the disabled, which can be either very pitying and very kind of obviously religious-based, like this one, which is by Igor Kalgaryov, who was a Christian cartoonist. Next, please. To representations of Maryasyev, right, who I mentioned before. There's a kind of graphic biography of his life that, again, very much foregrounds his struggle through rehabilitation to make it back into the air. Next. Even again, not only does he make it back into the air, but he's also able to become a great dancer, right? So again, right, it's not just being able to walk again, it's also being kind of a physical ideal, because he's as he keeps saying in the book and in the film, I'm a real Soviet man, right? Настоящий советский человек. Next, please. To something like this, which is very, very recent, and I'm going to finish up here, a fascinating series of comics by Tatiana Faskutneva, which is a difficult name for me to pronounce, who is from the provinces, whereby she collaborates with a man named Leonid Rodin, who's a teenage obviously person in a wheelchair, and gets into kind of the difficulties of his life. For example, you can see him having trouble trying to board the tram there. He's also a DJ. He has a very active kind of social life. And it's all in a very big way trying to get away from this idea of him as an object of pity or as someone who needs to be prized as some kind of divine being, and just kind of showing his life, what it's like to live in the difficulties as well as the joys. And I find it a wonderful thing, particularly because this artist is also very young and dealing with these questions, I think, in a very, very kind of progressive way that can only yield, I think, positive results, it seems to me. So that's the end. Thank you.
Thank you.